Hello and welcome. I'm delighted that you're all here tonight for this event. The hot topic for this evening's discussion is the IMO 2020 sulphur cap. And because my mother told me never to lie, I'm happy to report that it really is a hot topic. There's been several articles in the legal and trade press only this week giving warnings about the likely effect of the cap. And the IMO met last week and produced guidance and some guidelines to what they say is to support the consistent implementation of the cap. Fortunately, on our panel this evening, we have three speakers here to help you survive the bunker Armageddon. First of all, we have James Turner, who will address the regulatory position. Secondly, our guest speaker, Nick Chell from LAC, will discuss some of the technical challenges and give us some solutions in dealing with the sulphur cap. And thirdly, Tom Macy-Dare will consider some of the legal issues arising under time charter parties in connection with the cap. And then we will round up our session this evening with an opportunity for you to ask some questions of our panel. And I stress of our panel, not me. So firstly, let me introduce James Turner, QC. This is the best part. James is a shipping and commercial silk here at Quadrant Chambers. His practice encompasses a wide range of disputes, including shipbuilding, charter parties, carriage, and collision. I would personally describe James as exceptionally tall, but I discovered last night that the legal directories choose to focus on his other qualities. So they describe him, amongst other things, as bright, very clever and sensible, and as someone who provides clear and authoritative advice. So James is going to put these skills to good use this evening and hopefully make some sense for us of the regulatory framework.
Now, I'm going to give a brief, mercifully brief, and very high-level overview of the regulatory position for the 3 or 4 of you in the room who don't know what the sulphur cap is or how we got here. Just in case you've forgotten, and some of you may possibly be young enough not to know, acid rain and that sort of thing has been with us, well, for a long time, but became big in the 1980s. And not only did it kill quite a lot of forests and lakes, particularly in Scandinavia, but as you can see from this slide, it's also ruined some of our masonry. So the world's shipping community through the IMO, particularly after the big disasters of the 60s and 70s, set about a better way of regulating things. And it started with Marpol 1973, the convention, which in that form never came into force. And it took modification by the Protocol of 1978 to get things ticking along again. And that's now been in force since the 2nd of October 1983. It currently has 158 states who are party to it, representing a whisker over 99% of the world's tonnage, which is quite a good effort. Now, the various elements of the environment that are regulated through Marpol are dealt with in different annexes. And I've listed them there on the slide. I'm not going to solemnly read them out. The one that we're interested in is number 6, air pollution. Now, this is how the world was before Annex VI came into force. And sadly, even nowadays, you may get to see something like that. Now, Annex VI wasn't there to start with. It was added to Marpol by the 1997 protocol. It introduced what are now called Tier 1 emission standards for sulphur and nitrogen oxide, and it banned the emission of ozone-depleting substances. It had application to engines, as you can see, of a certain power for vessels constructed on and after the beginning of the new millennium. It also introduced sulphur and nitrogen emission control areas and designated the Baltic Sea as the first sulphur ECA, with the North Sea subsequently added and enforced at the same time. And it entered into force following ratification by states representing half the world's tonnage on the 19th of May 2005. Now, this annex introduced the requirements to regulate air pollution from ships. So it's not just ozone depleting substances and nitrogen oxides and sulfur oxides, it's also volatile organic compounds, shipboard incineration, and it also establishes requirements for reception facilities for wastes from exhaust gas cleaning systems, incinerators, and so on. This is a photograph taken 4 days after Annex VI came into force. And of course, if you compare it to the earlier one, don't tell me that there is no power in legislation. Now, the more interesting, for our purposes, more interesting amendments were introduced in 2008. 2008 introduced Tiers 2 and 3 and new fuel quality requirements. Tiers 2 and 3 relate to nitrogen oxide emission standards, so we can skate over them relatively quickly for present purposes. Most importantly, it set a series of reducing maximum sulphur content limits in fuel oil, and that included the 1st of January 2020 limit, subject to a review of fuel availability that was going to be carried out in 2018. Now, you'll have noticed that there is often a delay between the production of these conventions and them coming into force, and most of you will know that the IMO has been quite cute in navigating its way around that. And what it introduced in the Marpol Convention and Protocol was the system of automatic entry into force. And it's now up to states who are party to object to changes in the convention. And if they fail to do so in sufficient numbers, then it comes into force automatically. And that is what Article 16.2(f)(3) is all about. And that is why the 2008 amendments entered into force relatively rapidly in July 2010. Continuing with the history of the development of Annex VI, the next big change was the introduction of the energy efficiency regulations, so-called EEDI, in 2013. And at that time, the US Caribbean was added as an ECA. In October 2016, 2 years ahead of schedule, was the review of fuel availability. So it became clear in 2016 that the 2020 date for the sulphur cap was going to be effective. In 2018, the Marine Environment Protection Committee approved ship implementation planning guidance, and they added the prohibition on carriage of non-compliant fuel oil for combustion, unless the vessel is fitted with a scrubber, with effect from March next year. And just last week, the MEPC met again, and they adopted a raft of guidelines on the new sulphur limit. And they include guidelines for consistent implementation, guidelines for port state control under Marpol Annex VI, Chapter 3, providing updated enforcement guidance, guidance on the indication of ongoing compliance in the case of the failure of a single monitoring instrument, guidance for port state control on contingency measures for addressing non-compliant fuel oil, guidelines for onboard sampling, and guidance for best practice for member state and coastal states. And they also adopted some draft guidance which will be confirmed at the next MEPC meeting. So one of the takeaways from this is that this is an area in a constant state of flux and development. And for those in the room who are involved in actually the gritty business of running ships, the IMO website is presumably already on your favorites panel. That's just a pretty picture showing you where the current IMO emission control areas are on the seaboards of North America and in the Baltic, English Channel, and North Sea. Here is a handy table. Now, when you look at your handouts, you will see immediately that I've got inside and outside the wrong way round. That was just to make sure you were going to pay attention. On this slide, they're correct. And that just shows you how the limits, both inside and outside sulphur emission control areas, have reduced over time. Now, one of the interesting features of this area is just how keen different states have been to, one might once have said, gold plate the regulations. So one saw China, from the beginning of this year, impose a 0.5% limit at all ports when alongside or at anchor in 3 important areas of inshore Chinese waters. There's also been talk in the last couple of weeks at a European level of new ECAs in the Mediterranean and also talks between Ireland and the UK, presumably for the Irish Sea. Now, who knows what I'm going to talk about next? Okay, scrubbers. That was the politest slide I could come up with for scrubbers. There are 2 ways to comply with the sulphur emissions limit. One is to burn compliant fuel, and the other is to install and use a scrubber. But there are limits on scrubber use. Open-loop scrubbers are banned in numerous jurisdictions, particularly China, parts of the USA, and Singapore. And the discharge of waste from closed-loop scrubbers is going to be tricky as well. Singapore, for example, very recently classified waste from closed-loop scrubbers as toxic industrial waste, increasing the cost of disposal. No one wants to have to clean up after you. Now, my final remarks, firstly, for those who are eagerly taking notes, you'll want to know the UK implementing legislation for this. That's in the top bullet point of this slide. That is going to be further amended after Brexit by Statutory Instrument 311 of this year. And you don't need me to tell you that that's the merchant shipping and other transport bracket environmental protection close bracket open bracket amendment close bracket bracket EU exit close bracket regulations. That's my Brexit reference. So we have a sulphur cap which has been in view since 2008. It was confirmed in 2016. But even so, you hardly need me to tell you that challenges remain for ship owners, operators, and bunker suppliers, not to mention refineries and storage depots. And one of the great things about heavy fuel oil was that you could burn all the nasty bits that were left behind once the fractions had been distilled off. Who knows what's going to happen to that? Perhaps Nick will tell us. There's a survey going on by Maritime CEO magazine, and early responses to that survey suggest that a quarter of the industry believes that over 20% of the fleet will not be ready for the sulphur cap come the beginning of next year, which is quite an interesting figure. Now, there are, of course, a lot of challenges. Some of them are technical and some of them are legal. And at this point, I'm very grateful that I can hand over the baton to Nick, who is going to talk about the technical challenges before Tom rounds off with the legal ones. Thank you.
So we're very lucky this evening to have Nick Child of LOC to identify for us some of the technical issues and hopefully tell us how to deal with them. Speaking from personal experience, I can say that Nick is this rare combination of someone who really knows his stuff but has his ability, and more importantly, the patience in my case, to explain it to someone who really doesn't share his technical background. He's an absolute delight to work with, and I'm looking forward to him guiding us through some of the technical aspects we need to consider as a result of the sulphur cap.
Thank you, Nicola. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, as James was mentioning, the sulphur cap, IMO 2020 sulphur cap, is related to Regulation 14 of Marpol Annex VI and the reduction in the sulphur content of fuels from 3.5% to 0.5%. It's a step change, and it's going to have a significant and big effect on owners, charterers and suppliers. Now, it's a global cap, apart from when the vessel is operating in an emission control area. Currently, those two areas, as James mentioned, is the Baltic and North Sea area and the North American, US, Caribbean area. In those areas, the vessel has to use a sulphur content with a maximum of 0.1%, which is essentially low sulphur marine gas oil. So some owners at least, are already using low sulphur fuel oils, or at least low sulphur marine gas oils in emission control areas. Marpol has also introduced an equivalent means. So there's an equivalent means of achieving the sulphur emission regulations, and that allows the use of a scrubber, so you can use the existing high sulphur fuel oils with an exhaust gas cleaning system. So basically, as far as owners are concerned and charterers, there are broadly two options. They can use a compliant fuel, or they can use the high sulphur fuel oil with an exhaust gas cleaning system or a scrubber. Within the compliant fuels, we've got the 0.5% sulphur fuel oil, which is going to be the new fuels that are being developed, and I'll come on to those in a bit later slides. There's low sulphur marine gas oil, which I say is currently in use, or there's to use LNG. Now, LNG, it's already in use. Vessels such as LNG carriers are using it as the boil-off gas in their engines, but you've got to have a dual fuel engine on board. You also need structurally to alter the tank, so it's not an easy thing to retrofit a vessel to use LNG. It's more suitable for new buildings. There's also issues of availability with LNG as well, and there isn't a big bunkering infrastructure in place. Most vessels would have to bunker by using a road tanker. And the low sulphur marine gas oil, as I say, owners are already using that. It's widely available, although it does come at a cost premium. It's more expensive than any of the other fuels. I think the majority of vessels in 2020 are likely to change over to the 0.5% sulphur fuels, although some owners may choose to use a low sulphur marine gas oil and see how availability of the 0.5% sulphur fuels develop. If a lot of owners do start using marine gas oil, that could lead to availability issues of that fuel, particularly in domestic markets. And then, of course, there's the use of the high sulphur fuel oil with scrubbers, and I'll come on to scrubbers in the following slides. Now, in order to prevent non-compliance, IMO's introduced a ban on the carriage of high sulphur fuel oil after the 1st of March 2020. So come January, owners have got 2 months in which to get any high sulphur fuel oil off their vessels. But they have to start using the low sulphur fuel, the 0.5% sulphur fuel oil, from the 1st of January. So port state control are likely to be taking a keen interest in January on what is in the vessel's tanks and what they're using on board. Now, as far as exhaust gas cleaning systems are concerned, well, the advantage is that you can use the existing high sulphur fuel oil. You haven't got to get any different fuels on board. Retrofit is usually possible on vessels. And one of the key considerations for owners is the return on investment. So to retrofit a scrubber on a vessel is probably about US $2.5 to $3.5 million, perhaps $4 to $4.5 million on an existing vessel. It's $4 to $4.5 million. On a new building, it's about $2.5 to $3 million. So the return on investment depends on the price differential, and currently on a global average price difference between high sulphur fuel oil and low sulphur marine gas oil, it's about $260 a tonne, and the difference between high sulphur fuel oil and 0.5% low sulphur fuel oils is actually a bit lower than that, somewhere in between those figures. So an owner might get a return on his investment within a year, depending on that price differential. Some of the issues, the owner has to decide which system they want to use. There are 3 types of scrubbers, and these are wet scrubbers I'm talking about here, open, closed or hybrid systems. There are also dry scrubbers. These generally aren't being used for vessels and more likely used for land-based installations. The space requirements have to be taken into account. With an existing vessel, the scrubber has to be installed in the funnel, so the funnel casing may need to be modified. There's also machinery that has to be installed in the engine room. Obviously, with a new build, that can all be designed and factored in at the design stages. This may cause difficulties, of course, retrofitting it on a smaller vessel. There's an increased fuel consumption using scrubbers because you've got the increased electrical load on the pumps that you're using. So this may be something that charterers or owners need to ensure they've got in the performance clauses in their charter parties, because there's likely to be an increased generator consumption when a scrubber is installed. And of course there's increased maintenance costs because you've got the scrubber itself and all the associated equipment that needs to be maintained. One of the issues as well is that high sulphur fuel oil may become unavailable. Obviously the demand for that is going to drop in January as owners use the 0.5% sulphur fuel oils and gas oils. So there's an issue as whether some ports will in fact stock or have high sulphur fuel oil available. So even though a vessel has a scrubber on board, certain ports they may not be able to get high sulphur fuel oil. And then there's the other issue about what happens if it breaks down. Well, currently the guidance is that if it breaks down for more than an hour, it's supposed to be reported to the flag state and to the next port, or if there are repeated breakdowns, whatever that means. So of course, if a vessel gets to the next port and it's broken down, they have to take on, if they can't repair it, they've got to take on compliant fuel. So there'll be obviously some sort of debate at the next port as to whether it's better to wait in the port and go off hire and wait for parts to be delivered for the scrubber to be repaired, or take on the higher cost of compliant fuel and use low sulphur fuel oil. So just running through some of the scrubbers, this is actually shows a hybrid scrubber. In the background you might be able to see some of the other equipment there, but it's shown in open loop operation. So although this is a hybrid scrubber system, it's showing what an open loop scrubber how an open loop scrubber would operate. So an open loop scrubber uses seawater for removal of the sulphur oxides. And it uses the natural alkalinity of the seawater to neutralize the acids in the sulphur. So the pumps you can see on the bottom left there pump the water up into the scrubber, which is the top middle of the picture, and there's a series of nozzles within the scrubber, and the sulphur oxides are water soluble, so the water is sprayed into the exhaust gas stream. Sulphur oxides, particulate matter, are removed. The solids have to be removed from the cleaning water, and then the cleaning water can be discharged overboard. And the solids are retained on board, and they have to be disposed of ashore. The solids can't be disposed of at sea. They've got to be disposed of ashore. The advantages of an open loop type system is, well, it's the cheaper cost of all of them because it's got a reduced amount of machinery and equipment on board. One of the disadvantages really is there are, as James said, some limitations as to where these scrubbers can be used. So China, Singapore, for instance, may not allow the discharge of the wash water. And then this is a hybrid scrubber, again showing it in a closed loop operation. Now in a closed loop system, we use fresh water to remove the sulphur oxide. So you can see there in the middle there's a tank there which contains the water that's circulated around the scrubber and back to the tank. There's some fresh water makeup into the tank, and chemicals are added to the fresh water. So it's the chemicals that do the neutralizing and the removal of the sulphur oxides. And that chemical is sodium hydroxide, caustic soda. It's a hazardous chemical which has to be kept on board. And again, with a closed loop scrubber, there is some discharge of the wash water, but because chemicals are used to neutralize or remove the sulphur in the fuel, there's a much lower amount of wash water produced than with an open loop system. So in ports where you're not allowed to discharge the wash water, there is a holding tank, and the wash water can be stored on board because you're not producing that much wash water. That can be stored, and then once you get away to sea, you can discharge that wash water overboard. So the disadvantages of this system, well, the advantages is it can be used in all areas where there's a restriction. Disadvantages, well, you've got the freshwater storage, increased freshwater usage, and you've got these hazardous chemicals on board as well. But the hybrid system has the advantage of both the open and closed systems. Now, whether you've got the hybrid or an open or closed system, that requires monitoring. So this just shows some of the monitoring that's carried out. There are two routes for approval of scrubbers, Scheme A and Scheme B. Now, Scheme A is where the scrubber itself is certified, and then there's continuous monitoring of key operating parameters such as water pressure, wash water flow, exhaust gas pressure, and a few others, and daily monitoring of the sulphur dioxide and carbon dioxide emissions. And you can see at the top of the scrubber there, it's showing the excuse me, the measurement points for the sulphur dioxide and the carbon dioxide. And it's the ratio of those two that determines whether the system is compliant with a 0.5% sulphur fuel. Scheme B, the unit is not certificated, and compliance is demonstrated in service by continuous exhaust gas monitoring. So the exhaust gas that's coming out of the top of the scrubber is continually monitored. And then there's daily monitoring of some other key parameters. Both systems, however, have to monitor the wash water. So the box at the top right there shows some of the measuring points for the wash water. And PAH, if you wonder what PAH is, that's polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are hazardous components from unburnt fuel oil. So these are items that the pH going in and the pH coming out, all these things have to be monitored. The data that is recorded against time and the ship's position, and it has to be retained on board for 18 months and has to be downloadable. So if you're involved in a dispute and the owner's telling you he hasn't got any data from his exhaust gas monitoring system, he's telling you porkies, because they have to retain that for 18 months. And obviously the scrubber system, the scrubber itself and all the system and the monitoring systems requires crew training in the operation and maintenance, handling and storing of those hazardous chemicals, calibration of the sensors, and record keeping. Maintenance and operation procedures probably have to be, or they should be, incorporated into the vessel safety management system. And of course, there are potential for problems to occur if the system isn't properly maintained and monitored. And finally, the last slide on scrubbers is there's a fair amount of scrubber documentation for each scrubber. So there's a SOx emission compliance plan, SECP. This lists each item of fuel or combustion equipment on board, the main engine, the generators and boilers, and so on, and the method of compliance, whether it's Scheme A or Scheme B. And there's a SOx emissions compliance certificate, which again is only required for Scheme A, because that's the only, in Scheme A, it's only the scrubber that is certified. And then, depending on which scheme you're on, there's also a technical manual. And this lists things such as the range of operating values for the scrubber and the system, and the verification procedure for surveys of the scrubber. They're contained in the technical manual. And these are documents that are produced by the scrubber manufacturer. And then there's an onboard monitoring manual, an OMM as it's referred to. That lists the requirements for the service and maintenance of the various sensors and analyzers within the system, and such as zero and span checks for the analyzer. So this is the sort of thing that will probably be carried out by the crew. So they'll need to the vessel will need to carry calibration gases on board, and the crew will obviously need to be trained in calibrating these systems. And then there's an EGC record book, which just keeps a record of the in-service operating parameters, any adjustments and maintenance and service records. And then the scrubber is also, or the scrubber and its associated machinery, is also subject to the normal annual, intermediate and renewal surveys by flag state, in which case it's likely to be carried out by the Classification Society. So moving on to the 0.5% sulphur fuel. Well, the advantages, well, certainly over some of the other fuels, well, LNG in particular, there's reduced operational difficulty. For many owners, it probably won't make any difference to how the engine is operated. Reduced cost compared to low sulphur marine gas oil. Some of the issues, well, there's availability is one of the issues we read about quite often. 2 studies were done on the availability of fuel. The first one that was done by CE Delft which was commissioned by IMO, considered there would be sufficient fuel available. But there was another study done by, or commissioned by BIMCO. They considered that there wouldn't be sufficient fuel available. But most of the oil majors are stating that they will have 0.5% sulphur fuels available in all of the major ports. But it's likely that smaller bunker ports are not going to have the 0.5% sulphur fuel available. Another issue is, I'll come on to these last three issues in the following slides, but there's issues about the quality of the various blends that are going to be used to produce these 0.5% sulphur fuels, whether the 0.5% sulphur fuels are covered by the International Fuel Standard, ISO 8217, and what happens in the case of non-compliance if you can't get the 0.5% sulphur fuels. And that's where there's this FONAR, which is a fuel oil non-availability report. And I'll come on to these in the next slide. So when CE Delft did their study, they came up with several recipes, if you like, that they said, well, these are the sort of blends that can be produced to give the 0.5% sulphur fuels. And they did this for various regions. And the viscosity of the fuels generally varied from about 10 to 180 centistokes. I've just shown three of them here. And many of the blend components are cracked components. They've been through a cracking process, so there's likely to be, or there's the potential for cap fines or aluminium and silicon particles being present in those, some of those blend components. The separator manufacturer Alfa Laval is already warning about the possible problem with that. If you look at the US one in the middle there, at the bottom, we've got one of the blend components is kerosene. Well, if you look at the material safety data sheet for kerosene on the World Fuel Services website, that has a flash point of 38 degrees C. Now, if that's blended into the fuel, that then becomes an inherent property of the fuel. So the fuel itself will have a flash point of less than 60 degrees C, so it's in breach of SOLAS. So we can also see that the various blend stocks, if you look at the Europe one on the left and the Asia one on the right, there's a big difference in the amount of blend stocks there. So one of the issues is the mixing of the fuels and the compatibility with these various 0.5% sulphur fuel oils. So, I mean, you shouldn't be mixing fuels at the moment. It's always good advice never to mix bunkers. But I think it's going to be more of a problem. It's likely to be more of a problem with these 0.5% sulphur fuels. And certainly it's something that owners need to be more aware of. Quality issues, well, cap fines I've already mentioned. Compatibility between the bunkers, which can cause instability. Filters and separator problems. And with distillate fuels in particular, I mean, these are going to be residual grade fuels, but with distillate fuels, there's cold flow properties of fuels. And there's always the risk of chemical waste being introduced, as we, the cases that we see and still see going on now. Just moving on to cap fines, this just shows a piston ring there. On the top left there, you can see the thickness of a new piston ring. And in the middle of the picture, there's a piston ring that's completely worn. This excessive wear has been caused by cap fines, these highly abrasive aluminosilicate particles present in the fuel, which has come from the catalytic cracking process. This wear can occur rapidly, within days, depending on the level of cap fines in the fuel, and can eventually result in an engine failing to start. And if the separators are not working properly, which is where the cap fines are removed, that's how they're reduced to acceptable levels on board the vessel. If they're not working properly, then they may not be reduced sufficiently. And compatibility, well, if you can have two fuels that are perfectly okay on their own, but if they're not compatible with one another, when you mix them together, the resulting blend can become unstable. Stability test in ISO 8217 is what's known as the total sediment potential test. And when you get an unstable fuel, this is showing that a fuel oil separator with the top cover removed, you can see all the sludge that's choking up the separator. In extreme cases, you just can't get enough fuel through to the main engine. Sometimes additives can help, but then you've still got to dispose of all the sludge that's being produced. As I mentioned before, there is a concern about whether the new 0.5% sulphur fuels will be covered by the international fuel standard, ISO 8217? And the answer is that they will be covered by ISO 8217. IMO has asked ISO to look into quality concerns, and they've currently got a working group looking into that. And I think they're likely to be looking at issues of stability and compatibility rather than completely changing the standard. Charter parties, typically, they'll say they have the fuel specification listed there, so it's the second point there, which is probably say IFO 380, which is the viscosity of the fuel, RMG 380, which is the grade in ISO 8217. That's typically what you see in a charter party. The fuel that you actually get is probably not going to be a 380. As I mentioned before, those CE Delft studies showed it went from 10 centistokes to 180 centistokes. So we're unlikely to see viscosities as high as 380 centistokes in the new fuels. But ISO 8217, the limit is a maximum viscosity. So you can have a lower viscosity and it might still be within limits. The issue is whether it can still be used in the main engine. And flash point, stability and pour point, other issues that are concerns with these new 0.5% sulphur fuels, they're also covered in ISO 8217. There may be a need, though, to consider alternative or additional stability tests, and that's something I'll say that ISO is currently looking into. So this just shows 3 of the fuel grades from ISO 8217, which is an extract of the 3 of the residual grades. The one on the right is the RMG 380 grade, so that's the fuel that's normally used nowadays or normally ordered nowadays. You'll be ordered against that specification limit, but that's got a maximum viscosity of 380 centistokes. You can see in the second line down there on the right-hand side. But it's likely that the new fuels you get, the 0.5% sulphur fuels, will be a much lower viscosity than that. So it could be that you get, for instance, an RMD 80 grade in the middle column there. But that's not going to cause any problems on board the ship. Or it may be that you get a low viscosity, like 80 centistokes, that's in the RMD 80, but because you've got a higher level of vanadium, for instance, the fuel will still be classed as a RMG 380. The point is, so long as if you're ordering a 380, it's so long as those parameters on the right-hand side aren't exceeded. So what should owners be doing? Well, they need to be preparing a ship implementation plan. IMO has a guidance for preparing an implementation plan. It's not mandatory, but it's probably something that's going to be taken into account by Port State Control when they're inspecting vessels to check compliance. Owners need to decide what type of fuel they're using. Are they going to use 0.5% sulphur fuel oil, or are they going to use low sulphur marine gas oil, and see how things go with availability of fuels? They also need to be seeking guidance from the engine manufacturer about whether they need to do any modifications to the vessel or the fuel system. And of course, they need to be running down the stock of high sulphur fuel oil prior to January. So although they can have fuel oil on board, high sulphur fuel on board, up until March next year, they've got to use the 0.5% sulphur fuel oil from January. So the stocks need to be running down, cleaning tanks and the fuel systems. And it's important that the cleaning of the tanks and the fuel systems is well documented, because it's likely that this is another issue that Port State are going to be looking into to make sure that, if they've left some residues in the tanks, the 0.5% sulphur fuel oil has been contaminated with residues in the tank, and it's actually over 0.5%. So Port State are probably likely to be looking to what owners have been doing about cleaning their tanks and systems. So if they've got all that well documented, that of course will help them. And there needs to be a changeover plan for the crew. The crew need to be aware of potential issues. Ideally, owners need to be using 0.5% sulphur fuel prior to the 1st of January, just so that they know that there are no problems on the changeover date. And of course, all this has to be planned with the charterer, because time chartered vessels, it's the charterer who is ordering and providing the fuel to the vessel. So there needs to be a lot of liaison with the charterers and planning with the charterers as to how this changeover and cleaning of tanks is all going to be carried out. And then there's a procedure, what the vessels do if this fuel isn't available, and that's this fuel oil non-availability report. And at the recent MEPC meeting just a couple of weeks ago, IMO have now produced guidance on this report. And if anyone's desperate to see one. I've got a copy of it here if you want to see what's on it. So as I say, compliant fuels may not be available at the next port the vessel is going to, and the vessel is not expected to deviate to obtain compliant fuel. So if it's not available, the vessel has to report to the flag state and the destination port that it's not available using this FONAR reporting form. The guidance is that owners must use their best efforts to obtain compliant fuel. Well, of course, it's the time-chartered vessel, it's the charterers who are obtaining the fuel, so the charterers need to provide the vessel with information about what they're doing to obtain compliant fuel, particularly if it's not going to be available. And if they can't get compliant fuel at the next port, if they can't get 0.5% sulphur fuel, but low sulphur marine gas oil is available, even though that's more expensive, the vessel has to use that fuel. They can't say, well, we can't get 0.5% sulphur fuel, or we can only get 0.1% low sulphur marine gas oil. We're not getting that because it's more expensive. They can't use that as an excuse. And of course, if they've taken on this non-compliant fuel, high sulphur fuel oil, and use that until they get to the next port, that has then got to be debunkered at the next port, and the tanks will probably have to be cleaned as well because the tanks have now been contaminated. And the fuel or non-availability report may not prevent action being taken against the vessel. IMO, or flag state, are going to be looking at the number of FONARs in the last 12 months, the number of FONARs for other vessels in the fleet, whether the quantity they've ordered is unreasonably excessive, more than required for the intended voyage, for instance, and any evidence that the owner has not planned effectively. So the owner has got to show that the charterer has planned effectively. And one of the questions in this form is, Section 3, evidence of attempts to purchase compliant fuel oil. And one of the sections says, name and email address of suppliers contacted, address and phone number and date of contact. Well, of course, the owner isn't going to know that. He's going to have to get that information from the charterers. And this has to be kept on board the ship as well. So the owners are going to have to be liaising with the charterers. What are they doing about getting compliant fuel? And then providing that information to the vessel so that they've got this form on board to show the relevant authorities. So just to summarise, as we mentioned, it's going to be a step change reduction. It's going to have a big effect on owners, charterers and suppliers. Owners have got two options: use compliant fuel or install a scrubber. They can use 0.5% sulphur fuel oil, or they can use low sulphur marine gas oil. It's obviously a discussion that would have to take place between owners and charterers as to which fuel is going to be used. There is a question mark over the availability of 0.5% sulphur fuels. I think that obviously that remains to be seen how that will turn out. And there's concerns about quality issues as well. But the quality of the fuels will be covered by the International Fuel Standard, ISO 8217. And of course, owners need to be preparing an implementation plan for the changeover in January 2020. And that concludes my section. Thank you.
Next up is Tom Macy-Dare. Tom is a sulphur at Quadrant trader. He's described as someone who's very detailed and technically strong, so a good follow-up to Nick, and highly recommended for his ability to give well-researched advice on complicated legal issues, so he's just our man. This evening, he's going to provide us with some of that advice on legal issues arising under time charters, both those which are going to arise under existing contracts, and he's also going to give us an introduction to the new standard clauses which are published by BIMCO and Intertanko, and which aim to address a number of the main legal issues explicitly in respect of new time charters. So,
thank you. Good evening. So I'm going to be discussing today a few of the many legal issues that the IMO sulphur cap throws up in relation to time charter parties. And I'll be doing so with some reference to two very common standard form time charter parties, the MYP 1946 and Shell Time 4. And as Nicola says, I'm also going to be looking briefly at the model clauses which have been promulgated by BIMCO and by Intertanko, which address some of the most important legal issues that are thrown up. Those clauses were published at the end of 2018, and so they are presumably being incorporated into charter parties which are being concluded as we speak. But of course there are a very large number of older charter parties, which won't redeliver until after January 2020, which may not contain any specific provisions dealing with the new sulphur cap. And these are the charter parties which are most likely to give rise to some of the most interesting disputes. Indeed, a number of them have already done so, as some of you may be aware. Before I leave this slide, there's a reference at the bottom to a BIMCO scrubber clause. It's in brackets because although BIMCO were in the middle of drafting one, they aborted that. So there isn't a BIMCO scrubber clause at the moment. Now, the IMO sulphur regulations give rise to legal issues in time charter parties because of the way in which the risks and responsibilities are typically allocated between owners and time charterers. Owners are typically responsible for maintenance of the vessel's fitness for the service and compliance with environmental regulation. And the charterers are responsible for providing and paying for the bunkers and the quality of the bunkers. So there's obviously a tension there because the bunkers which the charterers supply may cause the owners to be in breach of the environmental regulations and they may render the vessel unfit for the service. In addition, charterers are responsible for controlling the vessel's trading activities by giving employment orders. And as a corollary of that, they bear many of the risks associated with that trading activity through the warranty of safety and through the express or implied indemnity which they are obliged to give. Also worth mentioning that the bunkers on board a time-chartered vessel are invariably the property of the charterers, and that's something which is potentially relevant when one considers who is responsible for removing and disposing of high sulphur fuel oil, which remains on board after the 1st of January 2020. I'll come back to that. The most fundamental legal issue that may arise in relation to a time charter party in this context is who's responsible for the cost of ensuring that the vessel complies with the new sulphur regulations. Take the example of a long-term time charter party concluded some years ago, before people had really addressed their minds to the sulphur cap. The charterers will have been happily supplying high sulphur fuel oil to the vessel for many years, as permitted by the terms of the charter party. And then as the new sulphur regulations loom, they face the prospect of now having to supply probably more expensive low sulphur fuel oil. And with it, the prospect perhaps of having to order the vessel to less convenient bunkering ports where that fuel will be available, and perhaps also of having to pay very much more money to supply the vessel with low sulphur gas oil if there is no sufficient low sulphur fuel oil available. In that sort of situation, a charterer might well say to the owners, well, the issue here is really with the ship. She can no longer burn the fuel oil which the contract says that I'm entitled to provide. So it's up to you to install a scrubber at your own cost and at your own time, so that I can continue to use the charter party in the same way that I've always done. And the most obvious basis for such an argument is owners' obligation to maintain and restore the vessel's fitness. I've set out on the slide there the provisions in NYPE 1948 and Shell Time 4, which contain those obligations, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with those. So just looking at Shell Time 4, for example, we see in Clause 1 that owners are obliged to ensure that on delivery and throughout the charter period, little c rather, she is in every way fit for the service, and then little e, she's in every way fitted for burning the grade of bunkers specified elsewhere in the charter party. And then 3a provides that whenever an event requires steps to be taken to maintain or restore that condition, owners are obliged to exercise due diligence to take that step. So for our purposes, the event is the implementation of the IMO sulphur regulations. Now, a key element of charterers' argument that we're considering here is that fitness in this context includes legal fitness, and it's well established that that is the position. And on this slide, I've referred to two examples that are authority for that. First is the Derby, which is a case about the NYPE form, and the second, perhaps more significantly, is the Ellie and the Phrixos, which is a case about Shell Time 4. In that case, 2 vessels were chartered on the Shell Time 4 form, and during the currency of the charter, amendments were implemented to Marpol, not the amendments we're considering here, but different ones. And the effect of those amendments meant that the vessels were no longer legally able to carry some of the classes of cargo which she had previously been able to carry, and those were the classes of cargo which the charterers particularly wanted to use the vessels for. And that was because the vessels were not completely double-sided, as they were required to be in order to carry those types of cargo. The charterers contended that the owners were obliged to physically modify the vessels so that they were completely double-sided, pursuant to this obligation that they had to restore the fitness of the vessel, a legal fitness. Owners said, well, that can't be right. We can't be expected to rebuild the vessel. Slight bit of hyperbole in their submission. But Mr. Justice Cook, who heard the case at first instance, agreed with charterers. And importantly, he held that unless the event which caused the vessel no longer to be fit was such as to frustrate the charter party, which is a difficult thing to achieve, then it didn't matter for the purposes of owner's obligation how much it would cost to remedy the defect. They just had to get on with it, or they would be in repudiatory breach. And the case went to the Court of Appeal, where the court decided the case on not entirely the same grounds, but didn't disapprove Mr. Justice Cook's reasoning. I've just mentioned on this slide ISO 8217. This is the industry standard set of specifications for fuel oil. I think Nick mentioned in his talk something about this. We see there Shell Time 4 provides that charterers are obliged to supply fuel which complies with one of the specs in ISO 8217. So, just thinking about the argument that I've outlined that charterers might put forward, there are a number of possible counter-arguments to it. And one such argument is that focusing on the service which the vessel has to be in every way fit for, does that include burning bunkers? Are the owners obliged to restore the vessel's fitness to burn a particular type of bunkers? Is burning bunkers one of the services which owners are obliged to provide? Arguably not. But the difficulty with that argument is that the expression the service in the provisions that we've got here naturally encompasses everything that the charterers are entitled to order the vessel to do as part of the employment orders which they're entitled to give. And naturally, an order to stem particular bunkers and to consume a particular parcel of bunkers is probably an employment order, because choosing which bunkers to buy and which bunkers to burn is an important element of how charterers exploit the earning potential of a vessel and hopefully make a profit out of doing so. And so if we have a look at the Hill Harmony, we have here the dictum, employment embraces the economic aspect, the exploitation of the earning potential of the vessel. One way out of that might be to say, well, an order to load or to burn bunkers which contravene the new sulphur regulations is not a valid employment order. It's not one which charterers are entitled to give. It's not one which owners are bound to obey. It's not an employment order at all. And there we have again from the Hill Harmony the principle set out there. If an order is given, compliance with which exposes a vessel to a risk which the owners have not agreed to bear, the master is entitled to refuse to obey it. In some cases may be obliged to. Again, that argument has some difficulties because it presupposes that the owners have not agreed to bear the risks associating with consuming high sulphur bunkers, which the vessel used to be able to consume legally, but which she can no longer consume due to a change in the regulations. So it might be said that, again, that argument begs the question. So there are really no particularly clear and obvious satisfactory answers to the charterers' argument that I've been discussing. But standing back and looking at it instinctively, it doesn't seem to be right that charterers should be able to insist on owners installing a scrubber at their cost and their time in the absence of a clearly worded provision in the charter. And I would expect that an arbitral tribunal would be sympathetic to arguments that owners raised in opposition to that, perhaps based on an implied term that charterers are always obliged to supply bunkers which the vessel can lawfully consume. Just looking at the model clauses promulgated by BIMCO and Intertanko, first of all, BIMCO, in keeping with the instinct that I've just indicated, the framers of this clause have decided to place the primary responsibility for the costs of complying with the sulphur regulations squarely onto the charterers. And so we see in little b there, the charterers shall supply fuels to permit the vessel at all times to comply with any applicable sulphur content requirements. And the vessel there, as I read it, means the vessel as she is at the time. So if she doesn't have a scrubber, a vessel without a scrubber. And then similarly, the Intertanko clause adopts the same position, makes charterers responsible. And we have there 1.1, charterers warrant that they will supply bunkers, hereinafter referred to as compliant bunkers, A, of sufficient quality and quantity to enable the vessel to comply with the global limits on sulphur content of bunkers under Regulation 14.1 of Marpol Annex VI, including the maximum of 0.5% for bunkers after the 1st of January. So it appears that where one or other of these sets of model clauses are incorporated into a new charter party, then the difficult questions that I've been discussing ought not to arise. Another area where there is likely to be a great scope for dispute in relation to time charter parties after 2020 concerns responsibility for the removal and disposal of the old non-compliant high sulphur bunkers from vessels. And there's scope for disputes in relation to this because as of 1st of March 2020, the Marpol carriage ban comes into force, and that makes it illegal for high sulphur bunkers to be carried on board vessels other than as cargo. Also, removing and disposing of high sulphur bunkers is going to obviously present practical and logistical difficulties, as well as costs and risks for whoever is responsible. And the old high sulphur bunkers are unlikely to have very much economic value. So a classic recipe for legal disputes between owners and charterers. Before looking at how the new BIMCO and Intertanko model clauses address this, it's worth looking at how responsibility is likely to be apportioned under charter parties which don't contain clauses specifically dealing with it. Now, on one view, owners are responsible for removing the old high sulphur bunkers before the carriage ban comes into effect as part of their obligation to maintain the vessel's legal fitness under the provisions we were looking at a moment ago. But I think the better view is that they are entitled to pass that responsibility onto the charterers and the cost onto the charterers on one or more of the following bases. First of all, the charterer's implied duty to cooperate. So owners may have an obligation to restore the legal fitness of the vessel. Charterers have to cooperate. And because they own the bunkers that are on board the vessel, then that cooperation arguably involves taking steps to receive the bunkers from the vessel and to dispose of them once they've been removed. And the principle there is the one in the well-known old case of Mackay and Dick. And I've set out the quotation which sets out the principle there. Secondly, the implied indemnity. The reason why the old high sulphur bunkers are on board the vessel in the first place is because the owners complied with charterers' orders to load them. And so owners are probably entitled to an indemnity from the charterers in respect of the consequences of that order, namely the costs of removing and disposing of the bunkers. And then thirdly, in a sense, the old high sulphur bunkers no longer qualify as bunkers because they are no longer permissible to be burned on board the vessel, and they're not cargo either. So owners are no longer contractually obliged to keep them on board the vessel at all. And so this is a situation, arguably, which is analogous to that of the ship owner as gratuitous bailee, discussed in cases like the Winson and the Coss, where without any contractual obligation, the ship owner has a duty of care in relation to the bunkers and a correlative right to being reimbursed by the charterers who own the bunkers in respect of the cost of removing and storing them ashore. Now, the BIMCO and the Intertanko model clauses deal with these sort of transitional issues, including the responsibility for removing old high sulphur bunkers in some detail. So first of all, if we have a look at the BIMCO fuel transition clause, this is an additional bolt-on clause which is designed for use in charter parties where redelivery is going to occur in the period immediately before or shortly after implementation of the 2020 sulphur ban. And I've set out some of the key provisions in this slide and the one following it. And the key points are as follows. First of all, charterers are required to ensure that the vessel has low sulphur fuel on board, so compliant fuel, by the time the ban comes into force on the 1st of January, and sufficient to get her to her next low sulphur bunkering port. So charterers are obliged to make sure that the vessel hits the ground running on the 1st of January and that she continues running after that. Next, the parties are required to cooperate and use reasonable endeavours to ensure that all non-compliant fuel is removed before the 1st of January. But if any high sulphur fuel remains on board after the 1st of January, then if we have a look at little C1 there, the charterers alone have an absolute obligation at their own risk and cost to make sure that all of those bunkers are off by the 1st of March when the carriage ban comes into force. And then we see little d at the bottom. Charterers alone are responsible for disposing of the high sulphur fuel oil which is removed from the vessel. So that's very clear under the BIMCO model clauses. And the Intertanko model clause effectively adopts the same position. Again, it's charterers who are obliged to ensure that there are sufficient low sulphur bunkers on the 1st of January to get the vessel to her next low sulphur bunkering port so she can hit the ground and keep running. And again, it's charterers who are responsible for disposing of all the high sulphur bunkers that remains on board before the carriage ban kicks in on the 1st of March. That's clause 9.1. So these model clauses apportion responsibility for removing and disposing of the high sulphur bunkers in broadly the same way as it would be apportioned without those clauses. Nevertheless, they make matters sensible for anybody who is negotiating a new charter party now to incorporate one or other of those sets of clauses or elements of them into their charter parties in order to make things clear. So those are just a few of the many, as I said, the many legal issues that arise in relation to charter parties as a result of the new sulphur ban. Undoubtedly, there will be many others. In fact, some of them have been alluded to by Nick earlier on. And one way or another, I think all of us who are lawyers involved in charter party work are going to have plenty of things to keep us busy over the coming months and years. Thank you.
I think it's probably worth saying that in practical reality, of course, it may be that charterers won't accept the plain vanilla BIMCO clauses and will insist on some more equitable sharing of the risks. And that's exactly the sort of tinkering with clauses which is liable except in careful hands, to give rise to questions of construction. So the BIMCO clauses and the intertanko clauses look absolutely marvellous in principle, if you're a ship owner at least, but in practice the picture may be a little different.
I struggle to see why under shell time charterers are not entitled to insist on a scrubber being installed, but it doesn't seem to me to be the right answer instinctively. And given that one never sees, in my experience, a charter party of this nature that hasn't been extensively amended and added to, I would be quite surprised if one were not able to come up with one or two or three clauses from which one could get a decent argument that there was no obligation on the owners to install a scrubber. I think that is potentially a very good point. If they're not this charterer's bunkers, then they're presumably the owner's bunkers. And so the points which I referred to may not apply with the same or indeed any force. Well, that's right. That doesn't work. But the other two, and certainly the gratuitous bailee argument would seem to be equally valid, no matter who stemmed the bunkers in the first instance. Well, certainly, if the owners do require if they do request more expensive bunkers, then that provision applies. But it may be that the owners don't do so. They simply say it's a matter for you. But if the owners don't say anything at all, simply say, well, we're waiting for your orders as to what you want to stem, I'm not sure whether it's possible for them to bring themselves within that provision.
Well, I started off this evening by describing it as a hot topic, and it's likely to remain so for the coming months. In the meantime, I'm sure you'll agree that each of our three speakers has done an excellent job this evening of preparing us, and I'd like you to show your appreciation in the usual way, please.